There are executions that kill in seconds, and there are executions that kill for days before the blade arrives. Anne Boleyn's lasted 3 days. The sword took less than a second. The waiting took everything else. It is just after 8 in the morning, on the 19th of May, 1536. A woman in a dark gown is standing at the narrow window of a stone chamber in the Tower of London, looking down at an empty wooden platform that has been built for her. Her name is Anne Boleyn. She is, by law and by ceremony, the Queen of England. In approximately 1 hour, a man she has never met will walk up behind her with a French sword and remove her head from her body in a single stroke. The time it takes you to breathe in and breathe out is roughly how long the actual killing will last, less than a second of motion. But the hours before that second are what almost no one talks about. Because Anne Boleyn was supposed to die yesterday. On the 18th of May, she was woken before dawn. She made her peace with God. She said her goodbyes to her ladies. She waited. 8 in the morning, 9, 10, 11, noon. Then Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, climbed the stairs to her chamber and told her, with whatever face he could manage, that her execution had been postponed. She would have to do it all over again the next day. She had assembled herself for death, piece by piece, hour by hour, and then they told her to take it all apart and build it again tomorrow. Anne Boleyn was somewhere between 32 and 35 years old that May. She had been educated at the French court. She spoke French fluently, read religious texts in 3 languages, and once as a girl had served the Queen of France herself. She had refused to be Henry VIII's mistress. Other women had accepted that role and been discarded when the king's attention moved on. Anne held out for marriage. That single decision, one woman's refusal to be used on someone else's terms, cracked England away from Rome, dissolved monasteries, killed Thomas More, and rewrote the religious life of an entire kingdom. The scale of what Anne's refusal set in motion is difficult to overstate. An entire country changed its religion, its laws, its relationship with 1,000 years of Christian authority, because one woman said no to being a mistress and yes to being a wife. Kings had taken mistresses for centuries. No one had ever broken a continent's religious order over one. Henry did. Henry had made himself supreme head of the Church of England, partly so he could marry her, which meant that when he wanted to be rid of her, there was no pope to appeal to, no higher court, no one above the king. The machinery she had helped build was about to kill her. Henry was 44 that spring. His health was failing. His leg ulcer wept beneath the bandages. He had already chosen the next woman, Jane Seymour, quiet, fair-haired, the opposite of Anne in every visible way. He did not call himself a murderer. He called it justice. He told his court that the Queen had betrayed him with 5 men, including her own brother. He told them God had revealed her treachery. He believed it, or he performed belief so convincingly that the distinctions ceased to matter. And days before the trial had even concluded, before any verdict was formally pronounced, he sent for a specialist executioner from Calais, an English possession on the French coast. A swordsman, not an axeman. The sword in trained hands was faster and cleaner than the English axe. A single horizontal stroke, no block to lay the head on. The condemned knelt upright. Henry framed this as mercy. The trial was theater. The ending had already been written. The sword was already on its way. The man assembling the case was Thomas Cromwell, a blacksmith's son from Putney, once a mercenary in Italy, now the king's chief minister. The charges he prepared against Anne included adultery with 5 men, incest with her own brother, and conspiring to kill the king. The evidence was thin to the point of transparency. It did not matter. Mark Smeaton, a court musician and the only one of the 5 accused men who confessed to anything, had been racked. The evidence that condemned the Queen of England was a confession beaten out of a young man's body on a torture device. Everyone at court knew it. Nobody said it out loud. The 5 men were executed on the 17th of May, 2 days before Anne. Her brother George went to his death proclaiming his innocence. Her alleged lovers died without admitting they had been her lovers. The case rested on one tortured confession and one set of carefully orchestrated trials. Anne almost certainly heard the muffled bells that marked their deaths. She knew what she was waiting for. The Tower of London in 1536 was a working royal palace, a prison, an armory, a mint, and a menagerie all at once. Anne was being held in the Queen's lodgings, the same set of royal apartments she had stayed in during the days before her coronation, just 3 years earlier. She had walked into these rooms as a triumphant new queen. She was now walking the same floorboards as a condemned prisoner. The irony was exact. It was deliberate. Someone had chosen these rooms for her. Someone wanted her to spend her final days surrounded by the memory of the day she had been crowned. The space where she would die, Tower Green, was a small grassy enclosure tucked inside the inner ward of the fortress. It was not the public execution site. Tower Hill, just outside the walls, was where vast London crowds gathered to watch traitors die. Tower Green was different. Tower Green was private, reserved for prisoners whose deaths the Crown wished to control without the unpredictability of a London mob. Only a handful of people in English history had ever been executed here. Anne would be among them. Bounded by stone walls and royal buildings, with the small chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula standing only a few steps away. The walk from the Queen's lodgings to the scaffold was less than 150 meters. A Queen's last walk. Sir William Kingston was the man who had to look Anne Boleyn in the face every day of her imprisonment. He was the constable of the Tower, probably in his 50s, a long-serving soldier whose duty was to control her but also to report on her. Every word she spoke, every change of mood, was sent in dispatches to Thomas Cromwell. Kingston was not her friend. He was a professional witness writing to her enemy. But without those dispatches, we would have almost nothing of what Anne said in her final days. Kingston is the reason her voice survives. But almost every quote we have from Anne in the Tower comes filtered through letters written to the man who was destroying her. Kingston was not transcribing for posterity. He was reporting to Cromwell. He included what Cromwell would want to hear and may have omitted what he would not. What Anne said in that chamber reaches us through the ears of a man reporting to her killer. It is better than silence, but it is not the same as truth. Kingston's dispatches to Cromwell give us something extraordinary and disturbing, flashes of Anne's mental state that are almost unbearable in their humanity. According to Kingston, Anne alternated violently between extremes. At one moment, she laughed heartily, actually laughed at some thought or remark no one else in the room found funny. At the next, she wept bitterly. She prayed. She paced. She made jokes about her own slender neck, that it would be easy work for the executioner. Then she fell silent for hours. This is what almost no one tells you about people waiting to be killed. They do not behave like figures in a painting. They laugh. They make jokes. The mind cannot hold pure terror for hours on end. It flickers. It exhausts itself. It reaches for something normal to grab onto, even if the only normal thing available is a joke about your own death. Anne's laughter in that chamber is one of the most human things in this entire story, and it should make you sicker than her tears do, because the tears are what you expect from a condemned woman. The laughter is what tells you she was still alive in there, still reaching for something to hold on to in a room where everything had been taken away except the waiting and the walls and the sound of carpenters building her scaffold outside the window. On the 18th of May, before dawn, Anne was woken and informed that her execution would take place that morning. She prepared herself. She prayed. She made her peace. She said goodbye to her ladies. She received the sacraments. By the time the sun had risen, she was ready to die. And then nothing happened. The hours dragged. 8, 9, 10, 11. The ladies in the room did not know what to say. Kingston was elsewhere, receiving messages, waiting for the swordsman who had not yet arrived from Calais. Around noon, he climbed the stairs and told her, "Not today, tomorrow." The swordsman from Calais had not arrived in time. The scaffold needed finishing. The witnesses needed assembling. The state needed another day. Anne paid for that day with her sanity. The state did not consider her hours of preparation a cost worth calculating. Anne's response, as Kingston reported it, was this: "It is not that I desire death, but that I think myself prepared to die." She is not asking for death. She is saying she had assembled herself for it, piece by piece, hour by hour, and now it was being taken back. She had said goodbye. She had finished her prayers. She had reached the end of her own mind, the place where fear and acceptance meet, and the body stops trembling because there is nothing left to tremble about. And now she had to do it all again. She had to find the courage she had already spent. She had to say the goodbyes she had already said. She had to walk back to the edge of the cliff she had already jumped from, and stand there for another 12 hours. The official reason for the delay was that the scaffold was not finished, and the swordsman had not arrived. The real cost of the delay was paid in her chamber. That night, the 18th into the 19th, Anne reportedly did not sleep. She prayed. Her ladies kept watch. Outside, carpenters finished the scaffold by torchlight. The French swordsman, having arrived, rested and inspected his weapon. And somewhere in another part of the tower, the poet Thomas Wyatt, suspected of having loved her once, was also awake in his own cell, knowing what the morning would bring. The morning of the 19th of May, 1536, dawned cool and overcast. An ordinary, unremarkable London May morning. Inside the Queen's lodgings, a queen who had already died once in her own mind on the previous day was getting dressed. Carefully, deliberately, choosing each item with one specific purpose in mind. She was not dressing for life. She was dressing for the swordsman. She chose a simple gown, dark, practical, not the elaborate gowns of court, but something that would not get in the executioner's way. Every item she put on that morning was chosen not for how it would look in life, but for how it would look in death. The dark fabric that would not show blood. The hood that could be removed in seconds. The hair arranged for a blade she would never see. Over the gown, an ermine mantle. On her head, an English-style hood. Under it, her hair was arranged so it could be quickly bound up, exposing her neck. Anne Boleyn dressed herself that morning with the executioner in mind. She removed bulky items that might catch the blade or require adjustment on the scaffold. She chose a hood that could be quickly taken off. She did the swordsman's preparation for him. She dressed herself the way a soldier prepares equipment before battle, except the battle was a single stroke, and she was on the wrong side of the sword. There is something in this detail that goes beyond courage. It is the composure of a woman who has decided that if the world is going to take everything from her, it will not take her dignity. The executioner would not have to fumble with her clothing. The blade would not catch on a stray piece of fabric. She would give him nothing to struggle with. She would make it easy for him, because making it easy for him was the last decision she could make, and she was not going to let them take that from her too. She was thinking, on her last morning of life, about logistics, about how to make the man killing her work efficiently, about not making it harder than it had to be. She was, in this last act, a queen still, composed, practical, in control of the only thing left to control, which was the manner of her own death. And in those final hours in the chamber, she made a choice about her speech. She could rage, she could name Cromwell, she could proclaim her innocence and turn the scaffold into a weapon. Other condemned prisoners had done exactly that. A scaffold speech, once begun, could not be stopped. The crowd would hear it. The chroniclers would write it down. She could make the story hers. She chose silence instead. Not complete silence, careful silence. She would praise the king. She would submit to the judgment. She would neither confess nor proclaim her innocence. She would leave space for interpretation, space that historians would still be arguing over 5 centuries later. Why? Because her daughter was not yet 3 years old. Princess Elizabeth was in a separate household, cared for by servants who already knew the child would never see her mother again. If Anne attacked Henry from the scaffold, his response could be swift and total. He could declare Elizabeth illegitimate beyond any future appeal. He could exile her. He could do worse. Henry had already shown what he was capable of. He had killed Thomas More for refusing an oath. He had dissolved entire monasteries for their wealth. Destroying a toddler's future would not have given him a moment's pause. Anne's restraint on the scaffold was not submission. It was the last act of a mother, a protective shield held up over a toddler who would not understand the gift for another 20 years. Just after 9 in the morning, footsteps on the stairs. Kingston entered the chamber. He told her the moment had come. Anne's reply has been preserved. Acquit yourself of your charge, for I have long been prepared. She is not begging, she is not protesting. She is releasing Kingston from the moral weight of his duty. Do your job. Do not feel guilty. I have been ready for days. In her final exchange of private words, she is comforting the man whose job is to walk her to her death. The ladies were weeping. Anne herself was composed, pale but composed. She gathered her small handbook of prayers, arranged her mantle one last time, and walked out of the chamber, down the stairs, into the inner ward of the Tower of London. The walk was less than 150 meters, the most public walk Anne Boleyn had ever taken, and at the same time, the most private. She walked between her ladies with Kingston ahead and guards on either side. The cobbles and grass were damp with the spring morning. She would have heard her own footsteps on the stone, the murmur of the small crowd ahead growing louder with each step, the creak of leather from the guards' equipment, the distant sounds of the tower's daily life continuing as if nothing extraordinary was about to happen. Horses being led to water, kitchen fires being stoked, a city within a city going about its mourning while a queen walked to her death inside it. The crowd waiting on Tower Green was small, perhaps 200 people. Not a mob, not a roaring London crowd. A controlled, hand-picked audience of officials, nobles, foreign observers, and selected witnesses chosen for their discretion. Among them, almost certainly, stood Cromwell, possibly the Duke of Norfolk, Anne's own uncle, who had presided over the trial that condemned her. The men who had built the case against her standing in the front row for her death. The Spanish ambassador was there, writing notes that would reach Madrid within the week. The French observed more quietly, more aware perhaps that the woman dying had spent her formative years in their kingdom. There was no jeering, no shouting. The crowd was so silent that chroniclers specifically noted it. These were not Londoners come to watch a witch burn. These were courtiers come to witness the legal removal of a queen. The atmosphere was not festival, it was funeral. She climbed the few wooden steps. The boards were new. The wood still smelled of sawdust. On the platform she could see the French swordsman dressed in dark clothing with his assistant. The sword itself she might not yet have seen. By tradition, it was kept partially hidden. The platform was strewn with straw. There was no block. She would die kneeling upright. She faced the crowd. Visible, pale, slender, steady. The wind moved the edges of her gown. She would have been able to see the faces of the men who had condemned her. She would have been able to see Cromwell's expression if she chose to look for it. She did not look for it. Her speech was brief. The most widely accepted version has her saying, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die. I have not come here to accuse any man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned. I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler and a more merciful prince was there never. To me he was ever a good and gentle sovereign, and if any person will meddle of my cause, I require them to judge the best. I pray you all to pray for me." She did not proclaim her innocence. She did not condemn the king. She did not accuse anyone. She submitted formally to the law that was killing her, while never once admitting she had done the things the law claimed. One of the most carefully balanced final speeches in English history. Every word weighed, every silence chosen.
She finished.
The crowd was silent. Her ladies came forward. They helped her remove her mantle. They removed her hood. They bound her hair up so the back of her neck was bare. They tied a linen blindfold over her eyes. One of them, we do not know which, was probably weeping so hard she could barely see her own hands. Anne, behind the blindfold, was now in complete darkness. The last thing she would hear was a trick. She knelt down on the wooden boards. She prayed aloud, "Jesu, receive my soul. O Lord God, have pity on my soul." The French swordsman did not stand behind her. He kept the sword aside, out of her line of hearing. He waited, and then, quietly, he called out, possibly in French, possibly to his assistant, "Bring me my sword." It was a trick. The condemned, hearing a voice call for the sword, would instinctively turn toward the sound. Anne heard the call. Her head turned slightly. In that small movement, she exposed her neck in exactly the right position. She heard nothing after that. The blade traveled perhaps a meter through the air. It struck cleanly, a single horizontal stroke. The head was severed in one motion. There was no second blow. There was no struggle. There was no scream. Witnesses later said it happened so quickly that some in the crowd did not realize in the first second that it was over. Her body and head were on the planks. The blindfold was still tied across her eyes. And then something happened that chroniclers of the era considered remarkable enough to record in detail. At every other execution of the period, there was some response from the crowd. Roars at a hated traitor, sighs at a dignified noble, mockery at a heretic. At Anne Boleyn's execution, the crowd was silent. No cheering, no applause, nothing. The kind of silence that falls when something has happened that no one present has ever seen before. A Queen of England had just been killed. None of them had witnessed this before. None of them would witness it again in their lifetimes. Until 6 years later, Catherine Howard would die in almost the same way, in almost the same spot. But on this May morning, this was unprecedented. The legal killing of an anointed queen. The crown of England severed in a single second by an imported sword on a wooden platform inside a fortress. Her ladies came forward at once. They were weeping openly. There was no coffin waiting. There was no funeral arrangement. The administrative machinery of Henry VIII had not bothered to provide for the Queen's body, because providing for it would have been an act of acknowledgement, and Henry was already erasing her. The ladies gathered her head. They wrapped it in a linen cloth. They gathered her body. They wrapped that too. Their hands, by every reasonable account, were slick with blood through the cloth. These were women who had served her in her glory. They had attended her coronation. They had watched her dance with the king. They had carried her train through Westminster Abbey. Now they were carrying her body in pieces across 20 meters of grass to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The distance was nothing. A few seconds of walking. But those few seconds, carrying the weight of a woman they had loved through a morning that smelled of blood and sawdust, were the longest steps any of them would ever take. None of them, as far as we know, ever spoke openly about this morning. Their silence is one of the great absences in Tudor history. They had carried a queen's head across Tower Green. They went back into service. Some served Jane Seymour, some served queens after that, and they did not write it down. Some traumas do not become memoirs. There was no coffin. Somebody, a guard or a servant, found an old wooden chest in the tower's armory, an arrow chest, a box for storing fletched arrows. It was emptied. Anne's body was placed inside it. Her head was placed beside it. The chest was carried into the chapel and lowered, without ceremony, without a service, into a hastily dug spot in the chancel floor. A Queen of England, who 3 years earlier had been crowned in Westminster Abbey with gold leaf and music and 40 days of feasting, was buried in an arrow chest in less than an hour by her weeping ladies in an unmarked grave. No priest spoke over her, no bell was rung, no prayer was recorded. The coronation had taken weeks to prepare. The burial took minutes. The disproportion between the two ceremonies tells you everything about what a queen was worth to Henry VIII once she had ceased to be useful. While his queen was being lowered into that chest, Henry VIII was in the countryside, hunting. He did not appear at the Tower. He did not order a funeral. The man who had broken with Rome to marry Anne Boleyn, who had executed Thomas More, dissolved monasteries, rewritten the religious life of England, all so he could legally take her as his wife, could not be bothered on the day she died to be in the same building. He received the news by cannon fire. A single shot from the Tower, the signal that the execution was complete. Henry reportedly turned to his companions and said, "The business is done. Uncouple the hounds." The next day, he was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. 11 days later, he married her. The speed of the replacement tells you everything about the depth of the erasure. Somewhere in a separate household, a toddler named Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was being looked after by servants who knew she would not see her mother again. That toddler would grow up learning the story in fragments from people who had to be careful about what they said. The child who could not understand what had happened to her mother became Queen Elizabeth I. She ruled for 45 years. She never married. Historians have argued for 5 centuries whether the second fact has anything to do with the first. The poet Thomas Wyatt, released from the Tower not long after, returned to court and kept writing. Somewhere in the years that followed, he wrote a poem whose Latin title translates roughly as "Innocence, truth, faith, mercy, my enemies surround me." Reading it, you can feel him reaching for Anne. The blind world. The court of cruelty. Innocence besieged. He never wrote her name openly. His sister had carried her body. He merely wrote that innocence is gone, and truth hath left us all. When the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula was renovated in the 1870s, workers attempted to identify the remains of those buried in its chancel. They found bones. They tried to match them to names. Their methods were primitive. The remains had been disturbed multiple times over 3 centuries. Modern forensic specialists are deeply skeptical of those identifications. The bones beneath the chapel are almost certainly mixed. The slab that bears Anne Boleyn's name may not actually mark her remains. After everything else they took from her, her title, her freedom, her marriage, her child, her life, they may have in the end taken even the certainty of where her body lies. Go back to the chamber. The morning of the 19th of May, the woman at the narrow window dressed in dark fabric, looking down at an empty wooden platform. She knew almost everything we have learned. She knew the swordsman had come from Calais. She knew the crowd would be small. She knew the 5 men were dead. She knew her daughter would not see her again. She knew her speech had to be careful because Henry could still reach her family. She knew her body would be buried without ceremony. What she did not know was that the toddler in the nursery would become Elizabeth I, that her name would outlive the king who killed her by 5 centuries, that her execution would be studied and retold until the legend almost completely replaced the truth. A queen was crowned in Westminster Abbey with gold leaf and music and 40 days of feasting. 3 years later, she was buried in an arrow chest by weeping women who could not find a coffin. The king who broke a church to marry her went hunting while she died. The daughter she protected with her silence from the scaffold became the greatest monarch England ever produced. And somewhere beneath the floor of a chapel in a tower by the river, bones that may or may not be hers have been lying in the dark for nearly 500 years, unnamed, uncertain, and unforgotten. They took her crown, they took her life, they took her head, they could not take her name.